Today I'm going to be doing a little talk about definitions. There are a lot of words that get thrown around in the knife making community and knife collecting community that they may have a lot of historical significance. Hard to know exactly what they mean. Kind of the basic word that we're talking about today is Damascus steel. Has a lot of possible meanings. We're going to just delve into that a little bit, try to clarify matters some without getting super specific, because I feel like a great thing about language is a little bit of flexibility in there, helps people communicate. So Damascus steel is a word that kind of covers three basic categories. You've got the crucible steel category. You have what here at the shop we like to call pile steels, and that's basically any steel where you are just making layers. You're making a laminate. And the last category are pattern-welded steels. All of these are sometimes referred to as Damascus steels. At this point, the terminology is kind of all mixed together to such a degree that our feeling is it's not worth trying to rip it back apart again. It's never going to happen. So it's important when discussing with people and using the term Damascus steel to maybe add a little bit more to clarify which thing you're talking about. Which is why, for example, if let's say you're talking about the Japanese steelmaking technique, there's as we all know, we've heard many times, the steel is folded many times, and quite honestly, this was the most common steelmaking technology in the world. Basically. When iron ore was smelted, you got this rough mass of iron with all sorts of pockets of slag and charcoal and other junk mixed in there, and typically a broad range within that one mass, a broad range of carbon content. So one side might be pure iron, the other side might be cast iron. So, more than 2.2% carbon. And a typical way to refine that material all around the world was to fold it. Just like, kneading dough or, however you want to think of it, that folding evens out it homogenizes the properties. That carbon content in particular helps squeeze out a lot of the extra impurities, a lot of that slag, burn off any charcoal. So there are a bunch of terms that have historically been used to refer to this. One of the ones that we have heard a lot and often gets misinterpreted is shear steel. People often think that shear steel is in reference to making shears. Actually, shear steel referred to how many times you sheared the material and restacked it. So theoretically, the more times you did that, the better the material. So just, some basic terms that sometimes were used to refer to that piled laminate. Watered steel being one of them. Pretty much any steel that showed pattern on the surface at some point or another got referred to as watered steel. Other relatively simple category is pattern-welded steel. Kind of the two best examples of pattern-welded steel historically were the Viking and European pattern-welded steels. The Celts got into this, a lot of other people. It wasn't just the Vikings, but and they certainly they did a lot of specific pattern development especially twisted. But they got it, they did other interesting things, serpentine patterns, a lot of fun stuff. The other place that we really see that, very much historically is in Indonesia, in the crisp blades there, where development of the pattern was paramount. When you were making a crisp blade, you really, you see some just phenomenal patterns that were made. And definitely, almost everywhere in the world that was doing this, they noticed that a laminated steel, you could see this grain in there. You could see a pattern in there. So almost everywhere they started playing with it. So the Vikings didn't have, they weren't the only ones doing it. They didn't sew up the market on that, so to speak. Neither did Indonesia. A lot of it got done in the Middle East, and gun barrels and everything. It made it everywhere. Now, technology that did not make it everywhere were crucible steels. And the two most common terms you see, especially now, to refer to crucible steels are wootz and bulat. Sort of the difference between those. Wootz is typically used when referring to, kind of more the Indian model, and bulat is used typically referring to the technique used in Russia and the Caucasus. Now, I'm not completely versed in, especially the bulat. That's not really my specialty. And my interest in wootz is less historical than some folks. So, there are good debates to be had about what that term wootz really means, because it's not actually a term that comes from India specifically. So you can look into the work. If you really want to find out more about that, you can look into some of the work of Anne Feuerbach, I'm not sure. And Rick Furr has also done some work in that arena. And that's much more, especially Anne's work is much more on the historical and archaeological aspect, but also metallurgically, really trying to pin down the process. But the difficulty is, in some sense, the cat's out of the bag, whether wootz is the exact correct term or not. That's the term most people use. I don't think that can be undone at this point. So folks like me who are making crucible steel, and we want to communicate to people that we're making crucible steel, wootz is the simplest term. Whether it's the most correct term, that's a different question, and one I'm not addressing today. Some other terms that have been used to refer to wootz, or have been confused for wootz. Again, we got that watered steel. That's a really tough one, because watered steel just means it looks a little like water. Crucible steel is, historically, speaking, that's a pretty good term. Not so great now, since we've got the Crucible Steel Corporation. So if somebody says, do I use crucible steel? Well, are we talking about making your own, or are you talking about, going out and buying some CPM stuff? So that's a different matter. And really it just comes down to communication. I want to make sure that I'm understood, so I need to use terminology that we both understand. Again, that Damascus steel, Damascus, now in Syria, used to not be in Syria, because Syria didn't exist, but Damascus has been there for a very long time. It's been a trading center for a very long time. It's been that term Damascus steel has been a really convenient word for practically just any kind of steel. Just as today people will use certain terminology to sell anything. Well, hey, it's organic, or whatever the current buzzword is. Well, Damascus steel historically was kind of that buzzword. You wanted to say your product was somehow special or better. Oh, it's made of Damascus steel. Didn't mean much, or let's say it could mean a whole raft of things. Another term you sometimes see is Damascene. Now, Damascene steel doesn't actually refer to patterns in the steel. It refers to patterns on the steel. And typically you're looking for something to be considered Damascened. I think there is a specific technique, but again, the word's used pretty broadly. So Damascened is generally an overlay or inlay highlighting a design on the surface. So again, you're getting that, this reference to steel with a pattern, but in this case it's an applied pattern rather than an inherent pattern. So we're going to just briefly delve a little bit more into the wootz and crucible steel question, and what that definition actually means. So if you've read or looked at the articles by Verhoeven and Pendray, it becomes really obvious that they definitely had success in recreating wootz or the original Damascus steel. But what they were really going after was a very specific pattern that was prevalent in Persian blades, especially very late in the evolution of the crucible steels, the Indian crucible steels. And that pattern almost, the carbide banding looks almost lamellar or laminated, as opposed to, if you look at the vast majority of what are typically referred to as wootz blades, they show more like strands of carbide rather than layers of carbide through the material. So there you have kind of another spot where a definition is being put forth, but not really all that specifically. So in Verhoeven and Pendray's work, they defined wootz as being this very specific thing from Persia, this very specific pattern, which was just a subset, a very small subset of the crucible steel blades that were being made, even at that time. And of course, kind of ignores the very long history of the material. So, and that's really carried over. This idea that the only way to recreate wootz or true Damascus, crucible Damascus, is to achieve that almost laminated look. While, and that's just not supported historically. That pattern was preferred. It's a great looking pattern. Who wouldn't prefer it? But it's not actually representative of the majority of the wootz patterns that you see. Wootz patterns are evident in blades from a wide area, and also they vary greatly in really the very basic structure of the pattern when you get down to it. That difference between strands and layers. And also, just quickly to define, when I talk about wootz, what I'm talking about is steel made in a crucible that has fully melted and has a very high carbon content. Generally speaking, above 1.2% carbon. There are I know, for example, Ann Feuerbach has a much tighter definition. Other people have much tighter definitions. I find wootz to be a really convenient term to use. It gets across to most people what I'm doing and what I'm talking about. So I like to keep things as simple as possible. Lots of folks would argue with that stance. But based on that definition of very high carbon steel achieving a full melt in a crucible, there is, as I said, a really broad range of blades and patterns that came out of that. So this really tight definition of, you haven't recreated wootz until you've achieved that, the lamellar Persian pattern. I think everybody has that as a goal, but I don't think that's a great definition. Kind of got off track with that, but any case, this overview of some of the terminology gives you a good reference when you are reading articles, looking at blades online, whatever it is, having a conversation with another maker or collector, and might help keep everybody on the same page in that conversation. Just make sure that you are communicating. To my mind, it's not worth really getting to a giant dust-up over using exactly the correct term, as long as everybody is talking about the same concept. So that's it for this. The next little educational talk I'll be doing will probably be about some of the more technical aspects of wootz itself, or crucible steel if you want the broader term. And a little later on might also get into some of the metallurgy of, or chemistry as it were, of pattern-welded steels, how that process is actually working, and that's based on work by a lot of modern smiths who, looked back at what was actually happening when folks were forge welding historically. So, any case, that's it for today. Definitely, if you've got any questions, throw them in the comments area. We're going to try to be really good about keeping up with that stuff. Thanks for watching.